A few years ago, a couple of friends intervened in my life. Together, they convinced me that my dietary habits and my sedentary lifestyle would lead to an early grave. So, I started exercising, I started eating right, I gave up takeout dinners, I limited my adult beverage consumption, and I hit the gym. Results were slow, but after a year, there was a noticeable difference. After 2 years, I knew that the change was permanent and finally had the courage to put my fat pants in storage boxes labeled in all caps, "Never again." 6 months later, the boxes were gone. Gave them to Goodwill. I'm now coming up on my 3rd anniversary this August, and I am grateful to my friends and especially to God for leading me through this change. But I tell you all this for one reason. I tell you this because I want you to know what the most difficult thing for me to give up on my new diet, the most difficult thing for me to give up. Anybody know? Not chocolate, although that's number 1. I read that the other night. Anybody else? Bread. I think I heard bread. Absolutely, bread. Bread. It wasn't the fast food, it wasn't the takeout, it wasn't the meat. I don't eat any meat anymore. It wasn't the delicious nightcaps, although I do sometimes miss the gin and tonics. No, it was the bread. All kinds of delicious, wonderful bread. I guess she already showed that, huh? All kinds of beautiful, wonderful, gooey, satisfying bread. Almost everyone who goes on a diet says the same thing. I miss bread. There's something about that starchy staff of life that makes us feel full and nourished and whole. It is, after all, the quintessential comfort food. But for almost a year and a half now, many Catholics, locked down because of COVID, have gone without the most sublime bread of all, the bread of life. And it is time to be fed again. That's why today we're beginning a brand new 5-week message series that we're calling Break Bread. So take a look at this. Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to be looking at all the reasons why Catholics for more than 2,000 years have considered the Eucharist a necessary part of their spiritual diet. You know, you hear a lot about superfoods these days, right? Like salmon and blueberries and broccoli and kale. Kale's my favorite, and it is in my diet very substantially. These superfoods have amazing health effects, like they're packed with vitamins and minerals, they're rich with antioxidants, they're high in fiber, and they're low in fat. But for centuries, Christians have found that the Eucharist actually has the most impressive nutritional profile of all, because it feeds not only the body, but also the soul. And the Eucharist has many, many profound practical effects in our daily lives. And that's what we're going to cover in this series, the benefits of the Eucharist for us. Now look, we know that there's a lot of people who are still at home watching online, many of them because they may be immunocompromised and their doctors have told them not to congregate. Many of them because they're out of town. And we're so glad that you are joining us. But we want you to go out to your neighbors and your friends and your relatives and your family members who are not coming to Mass because they have simply got out of the habit. And we want to arm you with this information, and we want you to share these messages with them. Because by receiving the Eucharist Sunday after Sunday, there are 5 very, very practical benefits for us. For us. And today we begin with one benefit that I know almost everybody would like to have more of, including me. Now, at Mass, we get a front row seat to the life of Jesus Christ. We're not just hearing the words, we're not just watching something reenacted. We actually experience the events in the life of Jesus. And that's because every Mass is like a form of time travel. I'm not making this up. Mass is like time travel. With every celebration of the Eucharist, we unearth and open a time capsule that brings Christ to life in our times. Theologians use a fancy Greek word. They call it anamnesis. Anamnesis, which means memorial. But it's not merely a matter of remembering the events of the Last Supper. Because Jesus is more than a historical figure. He is the timeless Son of God living in our midst today. And so he does now for us, right now, what he did in his earthly life. He teaches, he heals, he forgives, and he feeds. And so in a real and certain way, the Last Supper 2,000 years ago actually becomes present for us today on this altar as if it were traveling through some kind of time warp. And you know what's funny? Is the same thing actually happened at the original Last Supper 2,000 years ago. Jesus did a time-bending thing there as well. He distorted time. Because if you remember, at the Last Supper, Jesus took the bread and the wine in the Passover meal, and he united it with the sacrifice that he was going to offer the next day, in the future. And he said, "This is my body which is given for you. This is my blood which is shed for you." In other words, he took the future and he made it present at that moment at the Last Supper. And he told us to do the same thing over and over again in his memory. And that's why St. Paul says that as often as you eat this bread and you drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. You see, what we do on this altar is a meal. It feeds us, but it's also a sacrifice. At every Eucharist, we are representing the once and for all sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross so long ago, and it comes to life for us right now, in this moment. This is why priests wear these funny clothes. We don't do it to look fancy. We do it because these are the kinds of robes that people wore way back then. We're making the past present for us right now. It's the same reason that why we as Catholics are unapologetically out of date in our worship. We are not trying to be up to date. We're trying to be out of date because we are bringing the past to the present moment right now. And so at the Mass, we actually stand at the foot of the cross at the very moment when Christ generously laid down his life for us. And it's in that moment, when that sacrifice is represented at every Mass, it's in that moment that we learn from Jesus something very important. We learn the same lesson that the disciples learned in the gospel story today. If you think back to that story that I just read for you, both disciples, Andrew and Philip, underestimated the power of God's generosity. They didn't think it could be done. Not 200 days' wages worth of food would have been enough, or wages would have been enough food. The 5 loaves and the 2 fish were not enough food. They underestimated the generosity of Jesus Christ and the power of God to feed us. And so Jesus, in the gospel, generously produces a superabundance of bread, and he satisfies the entire crowd with a lot left over as well. In feeding the multitude so long ago, in laying down his life for us in the distant past, and in the Eucharist that we share today, Jesus Christ always and everywhere is providing the perfect model of radical generosity. And that is the first effect, the first benefit in our life that we get from consuming the Eucharist. We become generous like Christ. We are inspired to imitate the generosity of Jesus. Every time our eyes are opened to the presence of Jesus in the bread and the wine, the more we recognize the poor and the hungry all around us. Every time we are nourished by the bread of life, we become bread for the world, sharing what we have with those in need. And so, if you want to become a more generous person, if you want to become a more loving and giving human being, the answer is simple. Come to Mass. Keep coming to Mass. And bring your friends. Because watching online is fine if you have to. But getting in line for communion, well, that's perfectly divine.